the National American Legion, the National VFW, they supported it. If they had opposed it nationally by these two organizations, the reparation would not have passed. And they passed because the Nisei veterans, the 442, the 100, and the MIS, they performed brilliantly. So Nisei veterans have contributed tremendously to our family, Nikkei community, and to America in general.
That you can see just what effect that the exploits of those men and the men of the MIs had to do with a lot of the country's policies. I don't think that there would have been redress without the 442, regardless of what anybody says.
Good afternoon, aloha, everybody. Aloha, everybody. So, on behalf of the Board of Directors, the Board of Governors, our incredible staff, our volunteers, everyone who's a member, and all of you who are part of the Go for Broke National Education Center, I want to welcome all of you here today as we explore the impact that our Nisei veterans had on the fight for redress. We got a bunch of dignitaries here. I know all you guys are dignitaries, but we actually have a few that I should mention. And here, first to start, is Nisei veteran himself, Don Seki. We also have, and I got to make sure, look at my notes, and I'm sorry I don't have my glasses on, but Rose Ochi, who's was Assistant Attorney General for the Department of Justice under the Clinton administration. Thank you for joining us, Rose. Oh, there you are. We also have former Assemblyman George Nakano. George. And our former Deputy Chief of LAPD, Chief Terry Hara, both of whom serve on the Board of Directors with me at the Go for Broke National Education Center. Well, the passage of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 was a historic moment, not only for the Japanese American community, but for the entire country. That act reflected the strength of our nation to not only acknowledge the egregious violation of our Constitution, but also to attempt to atone, albeit in a rather measured way, for that wrongdoing. America's promise is that we are a land of laws which provide equal protection and justice for all citizens, and that's regardless of the color of our skin, the country of our origin, or the God we choose to worship. Our nation abandoned that promise during World War II. And the passage of the Civil Liberties Act helped to restore that promise. During that movement, our Nisei veterans played a huge role. Their valor, their courage, and their loyalty prove that Americans cannot and should not be judged by the color of our skin or from where we come. Being an American, in fact, is a matter of the heart, a matter of courage and of loyalty, not ancestry. Now, we're doing a lot of things here at Go for Broke with the voices of the vets at the heart and soul of everything that we do. And I'm very, very proud to be a part of this. And if you haven't already been there, we've got an incredible exhibit next door. Who's been there? You guys all been there? I'm preaching to the choir, that's great. And for those of you who didn't raise your hands, know that because you're here today, you get a free ticket to show up and go there. And actually bring friends and family, because it really is an amazing, amazing time. And although it's a small place, you're gonna wanna spend a little extra time there to really get personally involved, because it's not something that you just look at and read. It's something that you experience. It ties to your heart, it gets you to think, and it gets us to be better people, I think, as a whole, just because of the introspective nature of what that pulls from us. Well, today, we'll learn of the redress movement and the role our Nisei veterans played, and our speaker and teacher is one we all know. He's leading the Go for Broke National Education Center as we boldly head into the future as our president. He's also a scholar and an author who collaborated with Dr. Harry Kitano to write the highly acclaimed book on the redress movement, Achieving the Impossible Dream, How Japanese Americans Obtained Redress. I understand he'll be signing copies if you want to get a book at a very special price. He's our professor, he's your friend. I think he's your friend. I don't know about the price yet, but we'll see as he shares with us today. Please give your warm aloha and a big welcome to Dr. Mitch Maki.
Well, I'm not Stephen, so I can't say aloha quite the way he does, but we'll try. Aloha! Okay, well, come on, we can do a little bit better. I know we're all from California, or most of us. Aloha! Aloha. Okay. First of all, thank you very much for joining us here this afternoon to talk about the passage of the Civil Liberties Act in 1988, and also the importance of our veterans in doing so. So to get into the story, let's just dive right in here. First thing I'd like you all to do is sit back, relax, and I'd like you to close your eyes for a minute. Now, don't fall asleep on me, okay? I'm going to ask you to come back in a minute, but close your eyes, and I want you to think about all the good things in your life. Your family, your friends, your dreams for the future, your significant other, maybe not your significant other, your dogs, your cats, your pets, all the good things that make you happy in life. And then I'd like you to imagine that tonight you go home and you turn on the TV and there's an announcement that there's been a terrorist attack in Southern California, in Los Angeles in particular. And they believe that the people responsible for this live in the Southland. And everyone who is a resident of Southern California needs to pack up their bags, report to the local high school in your area, and we're going to bring you to some place and hold all of you until we figure out who did this. We don't know if it's going to take a few days, we don't know if it's going to take a few months, but we're going to get to the bottom of this. What would you do? How would you feel? And where would you go? So now, in the interest of time, I'd like to bring you all back into the Democracy Center here. And of course, none of this actually happened. But to begin, I'd like to hear about some of the good things in your life. What were some of the good things that you thought about? No good things in Little Tokyo here, right? I saw somebody mention something over here. Family, okay, very good. Thank you, Trina. Family, anything else? New car, very good. If I had a new car, I'd be thinking about that too. Oh, come on, your significant other, at least just say it, even if... Disneyland, very cool. How many people thought of their pets? How many dog people do we have? All right, dog people. How many cat people do we have? All right. And I raise that because one of the saddest photos that I remember seeing about the forced exclusion from California was of a family saying goodbye to their dog. And as you talk to families from that time, it is a very powerful part of that story. And as any of you who are pet lovers can imagine, families had to say goodbye to their animals. And they couldn't leave them with neighbors because for the most part their neighbors were coming with them. And so to this day, I'll have people saying, I wonder what happened to Skippy, my dog, or I wonder what happened to Precious, my cat, or whatever the name is. And for those of us who are animal lovers, you know that that's a heart-wrenching question. So now let's go to the question of what would you do? How would you feel? Where would you go? What were the reactions? What were you thinking? Okay, so safety, concerns for your safety of your children, Carolyn, as you mentioned, but not wanting to comply, but knowing maybe you have to. Other reactions, what did people think? What were some of the feelings? Yes, Pauline. I'm sorry? Hell no. Okay, and that's because Pauline and many others here are post-1960s, right, where we learned how to say, hell no, I won't go. But certainly in 1942, that vernacular wasn't a part of the American way of thinking, let alone the Japanese American way of thinking. But hell no, I won't go. Other feelings? Yeah, Teresa. So escape, right. And how many of you thought, oh, come on, Mitch, this would never happen? Right, and it's interesting because I've been giving this lecture a long time, and in the 1990s, I would give this lecture to college students, and they'd all look at me like saying, this is all ancient history, it's never going to happen again. Then 9/11 happened, 2001, and now we see more recent developments happening in our nation where people are saying, could this happen again, or in what way could this happen again? And so that's the discussion that we're going to have today in terms of what happened, and how did our country come about to apologize for that? And of course, what was the role that our veterans played in that? So let's go back. December 7th, 1941, the imperial nation of Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, and it thrusts the United States into World War II. Japanese Americans immediately began to wonder what would happen to us. Would we be treated as American citizens? Because 2/3 of us had been born here by that time. And the other third, just to be clear, some of whom had been here 30 and 40 years, were not allowed to become American citizens. Because at that time, if you were Japanese, you were considered ineligible, aliens ineligible to citizenship. And you were prohibited from becoming an American citizen. So would we be treated like American citizens, or would we be treated like the enemy because of the shared heritage, because of the color of our skin? Well, we immediately began to get our answer. In Hawaii, the men that were already enlisted in the Army were considered 4C. Their rifles were immediately taken away from them to be returned later. February 19th, 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signs Executive Order 9066, which creates the underpinnings by which 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry would be forcibly excluded from the West Coast and incarcerated in concentration camps. Now, let me share for a moment here that you will hear me use very specific words. I don't use the word evacuate, because you evacuate people generally out of harm's way and voluntarily. You'll hear me say forcibly excluded. You won't hear me say internment camp. You'll hear me say concentration camp. You won't hear me use the word intern. You'll hear me use the word inmate. And the reason for that is when we say intern or internment, in times of war, the people you intern are enemy aliens. They are people from the nation that you are at war with. So if we were to say that these were truly internment camps and that we were interns, we would be acknowledging on some level that we were enemy aliens rather than American citizens. And when I use the word concentration camp, that is in no way any attempt to equate what happened to Japanese Americans to what happened to Jews in Nazi Germany, because clearly no one makes that comparison. And what did the Jews in Nazi Germany refer to those camps as? Death camps. Or extermination camps. And I think it's important for us to use the words that clearly depict what was happening at the time. I'll give you one more euphemism. On the placards, and in fact there's a photo of it, ouster of all Japs, on these placards, what it tells people of Japanese ancestry to do, both aliens and non-aliens. Well, we know what an alien is in terms of country of origin. It's somebody who has come here. What's a non-alien? Born here, citizen, right? But even the US government realized that they couldn't say all individuals of Japanese ancestry who are American citizens will be incarcerated in camps. So they came up with this new euphemism of non-alien. So for all of you who are American citizens here, welcome. You are all non-aliens according to the government. We see photos of that time. It was a time clearly where Japanese Americans were not welcomed. Some of these photos come from here in Little Tokyo. The old and the very young were all given tags, put onto buses, sent off first to places like Santa Anita or Tanforan Racetrack, where horses had been housed only weeks before, and then later on sent off to American concentration camps. People lost their homes, their jobs, their communities, but most of all, what was lost was a sense of place at the American table of citizenship. People were to spend the next 3 to 5 years of their lives in these camps that were located in the most godforsaken areas. Many of us know this photo as Manzanar, middle of the desert. And here's a photo, though, that reveals another chapter in this story, which is these are two women holding placards saying, "Now serving," right? In Hawaii, the Lieutenant General Delos Emmons allowed the creation of the Hawaii Provisional Battalion. They would later go on to become the 100th Battalion. In 1942, they started training, and in June of 1942, they were actually sent off to Europe. And in 1943, a segregated unit, the 442nd, was created. When the call went out for individuals to actually volunteer for this unit, in Hawaii, 10,000 young men immediately signed up and said, "We want to go fight." But on the mainland, in the concentration camps, it was a much different experience. You can imagine the angst and the irony of asking young men whose families were behind barbed wire, whose civil liberties had been denied, whose homes had been taken away, whose communities had been torn apart. "We now want you to go and fight for liberty and justice halfway across the globe. We want you to put yourself in harm's way so that others can have the liberty and justice that your own family does not enjoy right now." And this was an argument that tore families apart as they were trying to struggle with whether to send their sons or whether to support their sons when they said, "Yes, I will go." And in the beginning, as you can imagine, it was a very difficult discussion, and about 1,200 young Japanese American men out of the camps volunteered to sign up for the unit. But they became the most decorated unit of its size in American military history. And unfortunately, the reason why they were so decorated is that over 9,500 Purple Hearts were given out. 9,500 Purple Hearts, and that's the medal that you receive when you're either wounded or killed. The MIS was also involved in this, and in June of 1943, young men were asked to volunteer if they could speak Japanese to assist the military intelligence service in the Pacific Theater, where they helped to translate, where they helped to interrogate prisoners, and they were credited by General MacArthur for helping to end the war 2 years early in the Pacific Theater. So the question becomes, why did these young men do this? Why did they choose to put themselves in harm's way when their own families were being denied their civil liberties? And the best answer I can give you comes from a young sergeant named Kazuo Masuda. Sergeant Masuda was interviewed while he was in Italy, and they asked him, "Why are you doing this?" And his answer, I think, was the answer that many of the Nisei soldiers would have given at that time, and it was, "Because this is the only way that I know that my family could have a chance in America." Agree with him or not, right or wrong, Kazuo Masuda and many of the other Nisei veterans of the time realized that loyalty needed to be demonstrated in blood. I'm going to take us all back to that time now. You're all 20-year-old Japanese American young men. Okay? For some of us, that's kind of hard to imagine, but take us back to that time. You're all Japanese American young men. You're in a concentration camp. Your family has been denied civil liberties. How many of you are going? How many of you say, "Sign me up"? If it would benefit my family, I would go. So it's kind of like what Kazuo Masuda said, if it helps create a place in America. Any other thoughts? Who else would go?
So, okay. So My uncle was a Tuskegee Airman, and wonderful captain. By blood, you prove the right to be recognized as an American. So that's true for everyone that's of non-European descent. So thinking back in the day, okay, go, because that's what my uncle did, and dealt with the riots when they integrated, because he was there. But my 21st century self says it doesn't make a difference. So it's hard to answer the question in the present, in the past, based on the present, knowing it doesn't really make a difference.
I think there were some people in the 20th century that would have made that argument too, that it does make a difference. Yes, Brian.
In line with what you're talking about, I would have volunteered if I was in Hawaii. Now, if I was here and been relocated as, into the concentration camps, I don't know if I would have volunteered. That would have been hard. I don't know.
And in fact, that's what Senator Inoue had oftentimes raised, that being from Hawaii, he volunteered, but then after he learned about the camps, and he tells a very famous story where many of the young men from Hawaii went and visited the different camps over in Arkansas, that the question was, would he have volunteered under such circumstances? And to this, his dying day, he wasn't able to honestly say one way or the other. Any of you who would say, no, I'm still not going. I'm not going. First of all, there weren't a lot of Japanese Americans that lived east of the West Coast. There were some, but primarily 95% of the Japanese American community lived either in Hawaii or on the West Coast and were affected. So there were some scattered families that were east of the West Coast, east of the exclusion zone. And for most of them, they still heard of and knew, because nobody was so disconnected from the Japanese American community that they didn't know what was going on. So while they weren't necessarily incarcerated because they were east of the exclusion zone, they weren't necessarily in camps, they knew that they may have had families or relatives that were in camps. So yes, Norman.
I think one of the questions that should be asked is, if you look at then and now, back then, we felt we had no choice, because as a minority, any minority in that age had no rights, no legal rights per se. Today it's different. So if you take the perspective of what the Niseis and the Iseis were looking at, they were up against the wall. When you have people showing up at your doorsteps with guns and says, hey, you must leave now. What choice do they have? So I don't think the perspective of did they have a choice or not? Yeah, I mean, it's a great conversation piece, but back then, you didn't have a choice.
Okay, thank you. And I think that the point's well taken, that you didn't have a choice in terms of complying with the incarceration rulings, But just to be clear, there were some individuals, especially out of Hart Mountain, there was a group of 63 young men who were called the Fair Play Committee who resisted the draft. But I think the other thing that Norman pointed out that's very important is that America of 2017 is, of course, very different than America of 1942. And I think we see that today in the news as hundreds of thousands of individuals come out to protest different issues, while in 1942, there really were no people coming out to protest and support Japanese Americans as they were being sent off to camp. Last comment on this, and then we'll continue.
Okay, this is kind of a funny story, but it really is true. In Hawaii, a lot of the young men were working in camps, not the camp, but plantation and all that stuff, and they were kind of removed from the whole situation. And so, like with my uncle, when I talked to him, he said, a lot of us went because these army people came and told them, oh, you know what, instead of being a rice farmer or planting pineapple and sugar cane, you can have a rifle and you can kind of like play. And so a lot of them went with that attitude. It's not about, because Hawaii was not a state also. So it depended on how they approached these young men. And I never realized this until they told me this story, that a lot of the people from outside of downtown Honolulu was approached that it's going to be, quote, fun. And it wasn't fun for them, but they honored America and went and saw a whole new life
True.
in Italy.
Clearly, of the thousands of young men who went, they all had their own individual reasons, and those reasons spanned the gamut. But truly demonstrating their loyalty to the United States was one of the items that was in common with all individuals. So as I mentioned, they went on to become the most highly decorated unit of their size in American military history. 22 Medal of Honors and over 9,500 Purple Hearts were bestowed upon this unit. After the war ends. Oops, let's go. The war ends. The young men start to come home from Europe and from the Pacific Theater, and the camps begin to close. Japanese Americans are given $25 and a one-way train ticket to go and reestablish their lives. When they were leaving camp, do you think that the feeling was, hey, we were just wronged and we need to start a social movement? We need to demand an apology from the government. Is that what Japanese Americans were thinking? No. What do you think they were thinking when they left camp? What am I going to do? What else? Where do I go? What are the priorities that they would have? Food, housing, jobs. Let's put a roof over our head. Let's put food on the table. Let's send our children back to school. Let's reestablish ourselves. It was Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you will. Let's get back on our feet. But there was another feeling that was very pervasive for the Japanese Americans here on the mainland, and that feeling was a feeling of shame. That somehow we had done something to bring this tremendous injustice upon ourselves. And the best analogy that I can give you is of a sexual assault victim or an incest survivor who, through no fault of their own, has endured a terrible, terrible experience, and they blame him or herself. If only I hadn't been there, if only I had been dressed differently, if only I hadn't done X, Y, and Z, maybe this wouldn't have happened to us or to me. And so Japanese Americans as a collective community had this sense of shame and this sense that let's be so American that this will never happen to us again. Let's be 110% American. And that's why, as we know, that many of the sansei who are about my age or maybe a little bit older, many of us don't speak Japanese. Many of us were told, go and get good jobs, be American, and never let this happen to us again, right? So we move into now the 50s. And the 50s is a great time of change for America. In 1952, we have the McCarran-Walters Act, which allows for the very first time Japanese to begin to naturalize as American citizens. 1954, we have Brown versus Board of Education, which says separate but equal is no longer the law of the land. But something happens in 1959 that I would argue opens the possibility that someday we could receive an apology, that someday we could receive acknowledgement. What happens in 1959 that creates that opportunity for us? Keep saying Hawaii becomes a state. Stephen's birthplace becomes a state. Why is that so important? Because there were so many Asians in Hawaii, and as a result, what do you get when you become a state? You get representation. You get 2 senators, and at that time, 1 representative to represent you in the US Congress, right? And what happened in Hawaii after the war were that these Nisei veterans came back, and Hawaii is much smaller than California and Washington and Oregon. They came back with a righteous anger. They had just been in hell for several years in Europe and in the Pacific. They had fought for this country, and they were not going to come back and be second-class citizens. They were not going to come back and settle for a job on the plantations. They were not going to come back and be less than anybody else in the state of Hawaii. Many of them went back to school with the GI Bill, became attorneys, became doctors, became business people, and they transformed the state of Hawaii to the point where Hawaii now has had 2 governors that are Japanese Americans, has had multiple senators who are Japanese Americans, who have had representatives, business leaders, teachers, educators, you name it. If you're Japanese American, you see that name in Hawaii in leadership positions. They transformed that state. And now they were sending the first Japanese American to Congress in 1959. And that person, as we all know, is Daniel K. Inouye. And for those of you who may not know of his name, he was a part of that famed 442nd. He gave his right arm in battle. He lost his right arm in battle, fighting for his country, the United States of America. What better symbol of loyalty to begin to send to the US Congress than somebody like Daniel Inouye? And here's a more recent photo of him, and unfortunately, as we know, he passed away several years ago. So in 1959, we begin to have access to Congress. But we were still a long ways away from, as a community, saying, we want redress, we want reparations, we want an apology. And to give you an example, in 1962, at UCLA, there was a professor named Roger Daniels. And Professor Daniels had a class like this, and his first assignment was for everybody to write an autobiography. He had 2 young sanseis in his class, and they both turned in their autobiographies, and it started, I was born in 1943 in Los Angeles, blah, 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 blah. Dr. Daniels looked at that and he said, there's a problem with this. What's wrong with that? I was born in Los Angeles in 1943, blah, blah, blah. What's wrong with that? You would have been in one of the camps. There were no Japanese Americans in Los Angeles in 1943. Even the children at Marino Orphanage, who were a quarter Japanese American, were sent off to camp. So how could this be? He calls them both into his office and he said, there's a problem with your autobiographies. And they look at each other and they said, we didn't cheat. I mean, how do you cheat on an autobiography, right? So he says, that's not what I'm talking about. Go home, talk to your families, come back and see me. And sure enough, one of the students did come back and see him and said, Dr. Daniels, you're right. I went home and I talked to my parents. I was born in 1943, but I wasn't born in Los Angeles. I was born in Manzanar, an internment camp. He would have said internment camp at that point, an internment camp. The pain, the shame, the wanting to forget what had happened to us as a community was so powerful for some families that they hadn't even told their own children the truth about where they had been born. And I think if you talk to Japanese American, in fact, I know if you talk to Japanese American families, you'll hear that common theme, that growing up in the 60s and 70s, we did not talk about the camps. If you asked your parents, if you asked your grandparents, shikata ga nai. It can't be helped, we don't talk about it, move on, and so forth. And that's where we were in 1962. The 60s is a time of great change. The civil rights movement is happening. The anti-war movement is happening. And this is where we as a nation, not just Japanese Americans, but as a nation, learn how to say, hell no, I won't go. Where dissent is now considered an American value. We have the women's movement, and we have the ethnic studies movement. And it was in the late 60s that some young sanseis came together and they said, we need to remember what happened during World War II. We need to commemorate the camps and all that went wrong during that time. And they didn't fully understand why their parents went. And they didn't fully understand why their grandparents went without a struggle. And it's like what you said, Norman, at that time. They didn't fully understand the difference between 1969 and 1942. But they did say, let's have a pilgrimage. let's have a pilgrimage to Manzanar, California. And for those of you who know Warren Furatani, he was one of those young sanseis at that time, along with a guy named Victor Shibata. They drive up to Manzanar to plan out the first pilgrimage in Manzanar, California. They're out there scoping out the area, and they're thinking, okay, this is where we'll have our march, this is where we'll have the speakers, this is where we'll do our Ondo dance and whatever. And in Warren's word, this pickup truck comes driving up to him, a white pickup truck, and again, in Warren's words, he says, with this redneck guy driving it. He had a cowboy hat on, he had his gun rack in the back, and he drives up to Victor, and he drives up to Warren, and he looks at them, leans out his door, and says, "What you boys doing?" Now, for those of you who know Warren Furatani, the first thing you don't ever want to do is call Warren a boy, right? And so Warren looks at him, and for those of you who don't know Warren, great activist, great speaker. He opens his mouth and silver dollars come rolling out. So the guy says to him, "What are you boys doing here?" And Warren says, "Well, we are here to commemorate what happened to our people in 1942, Manzanar, California, blah, 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 blah." You know, it's only Warren can do. And then the guy starts laughing at him. Now, the second thing you don't want to do after you've just called Warren Furatani a boy is laugh in his face, right? And the guy looks at Warren and says, "Well, if you boys are here for Manzanar, you're on the wrong side of the road. It's over there." In 1969, we didn't even know where the camps had been, let alone the true history. So we had a lot of work to do as a community to go forward. In the 70s, we start to get more representation. As we mentioned, we had Representative Inoue, but by then he now becomes Senator Inoue. In 1974, Norman Mineta is elected to the House of Representatives from San Jose, California. Norman was a 10-year-old boy when he and his family were loaded onto a train to be sent off to Hart Mountain, Wyoming. And the story goes, as many of us know, Norman showed up with his family in his Cub Scout uniform, carrying his baseball bat and his baseball glove. And as he attempted to board the train, an armed sentry took away the bat, saying, "You can't take this. It's a dangerous weapon." Norman would spend the next 3 years of his life in Hart Mountain with his family. In 1976, we have Spark Matsunaga, who's elected as Senator of Hawaii. So we now, and Senator Matsunaga was a member of the 100th Battalion 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And so we now have 2 decorated war veterans in the Senate. And in 1978, we have Bob Matsui, who's elected to the Congress from Sacramento. Bob was a 6-month-old baby when he and his family were sent off to Tule Lake. So by the end of the 70s, we now have 2 decorated war veterans, and we have 2 former inmates of American concentration camps in the Congress of the United States. But still, the community was a long ways away from saying, we need to fight for redress. In the 70s, there was basically 3 trains of thought. The first is, let it go. It had been 30 years since the camp. Things were better now. We don't want to have to remember. We don't want to have to refeel all of those thoughts. A second train of thought was, no, what was done to us was wrong, and we're deserving of a good, clean apology. Just give us a good, clean apology. And the third group said, hell no. What happened to us was wrong, and yes, we're deserving of an apology, but we also demand money to go along with that apology. Okay, it's the 1970s, and you're all honorary Japanese American. If you're already Japanese American, you get 2 votes. So, it's the 1970s. How many of you are in that first group that says, let it go? We're doing better now. We need to let it go. I don't see any hands. That's because, oh, one kind of hand. Okay, Carolyn, all right. But that's because we're all post-1960s. How many of you are in that second group that says, give me an apology. Give me a good, clean apology? Okay, we've got several hands there. And how many of you in that last group that says, show me the money? Show me the money, okay. So let's go back to that first group, because I think it's important for us to understand the thinking of our community at that time. Carolyn, you kind of had your hand up. What were you thinking? I don't want to open up the memories. Yes, I mean, that captures it very nicely. And especially, it was true for our Nisei at that time, our first generation, our older generation, who didn't want to have to refeel and rethink, and they certainly didn't want to become public enemy number one again. Things were better for Japanese Americans in the 1970s as compared to the 1940s. And I remember I was a young college student, and I was all into this redress movement, and I remember speaking to this older woman who I think turned out to be about 62 years old. Doesn't sound so old anymore. But when you're 19, it sounded, and I said to her, "Isn't this redress movement great?" And she said, "No, I don't think so." And I said, What? That's crazy, you know? And I said, "Why?" And she said, "I work for the federal government now. I'm gonna retire in a couple of years. I don't want them taking away my pension." And my reaction was, "That's crazy, they would never do that." And then I thought, whoa, wait a second. This is a woman who lived through a time when they did much more than just take away her retirement. They took away her neighborhood, they took away her home, they took away her life. And so who was I as a 19-year-old to tell this older woman, no, you have to fight for this? And it was a very valuable lesson for me in understanding that in a community, there are a variance of thoughts and perspectives that we have to honor, and certainly that we needed to be very careful with during that time. Okay, the second group, who says just a good, clean apology. Who raised their hand there?
I thought, fat chance that we'll get any money.
And that's the name of the book, Achieving the Impossible Dream. I mean, and that was the truth. It's like, wait a second, guys. If there's any chance we're going to get anywhere, you know, maybe we might get an acknowledgement. Maybe we might get an apology. But there's no way on God's green earth that they're going to give us money for that. And if they do, if we ask for money, they're going to think, oh, it's all about greed. It's all about, oh, we want something for ourselves, and the principle gets lost, you know, and so therefore, let's be pragmatic. Let's ask for what we can do. Let's do a campaign, an educational campaign, and if America can learn about this, then that's a good thing. So let's be pragmatic. Let's not ask for money. But there was also a much more principled reason for not asking for money, which was, don't insult me. Don't take away my home. Don't take away my neighborhood. Don't take away my civil liberties, and then throw a few dollars at me and say, okay, now everything's okay. Don't put a price tag on my civil liberties. Don't insult me. Just give me a good, clean apology. Okay, we're now in the third group, the show me the money group. And I saw a lot of hands here, so what are some of the reactions here? Why money? Pauline, I'm sorry, all I heard you say was donate to Go for Broke. But you are right on. And the feeling was that in this country, money talks. And in fact, there was a judge, William Maritani, who was a part of this whole process, and he said, in this country, money talks, and if you don't believe me, the next time you get a moving violation, go into the courthouse and say, Your Honor, I'm sorry, and see how quickly he slaps some money on that apology. So yes, money talks. Why else would we want an apology with monetary reparations? It's part of the tort law.
When there's damage done, then we file a lawsuit. There's monetary, settlement there, and that becomes part of the deterrent from this thing occurring again. I mean, it's not an absolute guarantee, but it becomes part of the deterrent.
And that was part of the thinking, is let's make this a deterrent. Let's not let the government off so easily just to say, I'm sorry, but let's put a price tag on it so that hopefully they might think about it the next time they do something along that lines. But the other thing that George said is very important is that there were real damages. People lost their homes, their farms, their jobs, their personal belongings. It wasn't as if they just called us names and hurt our feelings. There were real damages, and so money needed to be a part of that apology to address those real damages. Now, even within this third group, there was a further debate, and that debate was, okay, we asked for an apology. We asked for money. Should the money come in the form of individual payments or group payments? Should we each get $25,000 in our pocket, or should we as a community get $2 billion that we divide up? How many of you say individual payments? You got some individual. How many of you say group payments? George got half hand. Trina got some hands over here. Any other group payments? Well, let's start with that. Trina, why group payments?
The large amount of money can do more for the community, and it can help build the community.
Exactly. If we went for a group payment, if we got $2 billion for the Japanese American community, we could build museums, we could build monuments, we could write curriculum and spread it across the nation so that the story never dies. All of you who voted for individual payments, you're all going to take your $20,000 or $25,000, go out, buy a Camry, and 6 years from now, it's not going to be anything, and we're all going to forget this. So let's pool our money together and buy something longer and something for the community. Okay, how many of you say individual payments? Norman, why individual payments?
As a community, we would still be arguing about what we're going to do with that money today.
So true, and that's exactly what the feeling is. If we were to say, yes, bring in all that money, we as a group are going to share that money, are we going to trust Stephen Kagawa to spread that money out evenly and equitably? Hell no. Yeah, I want that money in my pocket. So, and it's important to remember that in the 70s and even today, there really is no one individual or one group who has everybody's support and says, yes, we trust that group. The group that would come to mind, of course, would be the JACL, but they had as many detractors as they had people who supported them. So if we did a group payment, who would separate that money? Who would determine where that money goes? And there was also a principled reason. It was individuals who suffered. It was my father who lost his farm. It was my mother who lost her job. It was my uncle who died in the war. It was individuals who suffered. It was individuals who should get the reparations. So this was the argument that was tearing across the community in the 70s. Let it go, just an apology with money, and if there's money, individual payments or group payments. Finally, the JACL met with the 4 legislators, Matsunaga, Inoue, Mineta, and Matsui. And they said, we are ready for you to carry a bill up the hill. We just had a national convention. We voted for an apology. We voted for monetary redress payments, and we want it in the form of individual payments and group payments. We wanted it all. So we went and we met with the 4 legislators, and Spark Matsunaga sitting there, and he says, "Komatta ne." Big problem, right? Because the reality is that those 4 individuals in 1978 were not Japanese American legislators, they were American legislators. And especially Bob Matsui and Norman Mineta came from districts where they did not have the majority of their voters being Japanese Americans. And Senator Inoue at that meeting puts his arm on Bob Matsui's shoulder and he says, if we carry a bill to the Congress right now, this young man won't be sitting here in 2 years. Because they realized it would look like a special interest bill and that they would have to vote for what was considered an ethnic bill rather than just an American bill. Senator Inoue says, what you need is a commission to study your problem, or the problem. I don't think he said your problem, to study the problem. And he said, the reality is the American people don't remember what happened in the 1940s, and the Congress doesn't remember what happened in the 1940s. And numerically, he was correct. There was only about 11 senators and about 8 congressmen or so who were in office in 1940 that were still in office in the late 70s. So numerically, he was correct. But the jaws of the JACL just dropped because, for those of you who may not realize it, having a commission study your problem is oftentimes the kiss of death. It takes several years for them to study the problem. It takes another year or 2 for them to write it up. And then what if they don't decide in your favor? What if they decide that the camps were justified and that while it was a sad thing, it was something that we had to do. So there was that risk there too. And in the late 70s, it was estimated that with each passing month, 200 elderly Issei were passing away. So each month that we waited, justice delayed would be justice permanently denied. Okay, you're all Japanese Americans. It's the late 1970s. Senator Inoue has just said to you, we need a commission. How many of you say, all right, we're going to follow the senator. We're going to go with the commission idea. And how many of you are going to say, thank you very much. If you don't want to carry it, we'll go find somebody else. All right, we'll start with that. How many of you say we're going to go find somebody else? Overwhelming support for the senator in 2017. Really, no one is going to say, we need to do this now. We can't wait 3, 4, 5 years for a commission. We have 200 elderly Issei passing away every month. We need to work on this today. I can't convince any of you to go and find somebody else. All right, how many of you say we're going to go with Senator Inoue? And then there's a bunch of you that just don't know which way you're going to go, right? Okay, I haven't called on you yet. Why would you go with Senator Inoue?
Oh, I think he was a wonderful man, and I have great respect for him. And I've been to the 4 villages that were liberated by the 100 and the 442nd. The French have not forgotten, and we don't know. And he lost his arm, and you know, he came home in his uniform, and he went into a barber shop, and the barber said, we don't cut Jap hair, in his uniform.
All right, so the reality is, along with what was just said about Senator Inoue personally as a man, the 4 of them represented Japanese America within the Beltway. If we didn't have their support, we couldn't move forward. And because they understood how Congress worked, it was important to go with them. But there was a splinter group that said, well, we can't wait. We're going to go find somebody else that will carry this bill. And they actually found a freshman representative from the state of Washington. His name was Mike Lowry. And they approached Mike Lowry and he said, you know, would you carry a bill asking for an apology and reparations? And his response was, I know about this issue. My parents would talk about this around the dinner table when I was a young man, and I know just how wrong it was. And so I would be happy to carry the bill for you. Unfortunately, Mike Lowry was a freshman, and he was on the wrong subcommittee, and that bill died and went nowhere. But it was an example of a man standing up for what was right and helping the Japanese American community. Now, as George indicated, we decided, yes, we'll go with the commission. The bill was introduced, President Carter signed it, and a commission was created that would travel across the nation speaking, interviewing people as to what happened during World War II. 10 cities, over 750 people testified during that time. And here are some photos. Oh, is the PowerPoint not working now? Okay, the PowerPoint is not working. We'll get to that in a second. We went across the nation to cities, and here in Los Angeles, there was testimony. Norman, you were going to say something. Was it the right time? Well, okay, let me answer that by saying it was difficult to get people to testify. Because remember, this is now the early 80s. We had just come out of a time when people a decade and a half earlier were not even telling their children about where they had been born. Ron Wakabayashi was the executive director of the JACL, and what he did is he got together about 15 chapter presidents from the JACL, and he put them through a mock hearing. And he said, this is a practice hearing. He got 9 individuals to act as if they were the commissioners. The first chapter president gets up there, starts speaking, and breaks down crying. The second chapter president gets up there, starts speaking, breaks down crying. 3, 4, 5, 6. Not one of those 15 chapter presidents, all of whom were used to doing public speaking, could get through their testimony, because it was for the first time for many of them that they were speaking openly and in public about their experience or the experience of their family. And in that moment, Ron realized this is much larger than just a legal or a legislative issue. This is an emotional mental health issue for many people in the community. Another friend of mine, Richard Katsuda, was working in San Jose, and he was working with elderly Japanese Americans. And he said to them, go to San Francisco, testify in San Francisco, tell your story. And many of them said, no, we can't do that. Because for them, going to testify in front of a federal commission was like going before God and saying, you gave me a lousy life, or you did me wrong. Finally, he convinced 6 of them to go to San Francisco. And he said, on the way over to San Francisco in that van, you could hear a pin drop. Those individuals were so afraid of what they were about to do. But they went to San Francisco. They testified. They told their story in Japanese. And he said, on the way back, all you could hear was laughing and singing, as those individuals had faced their demons, had told their story, and there was a sense of relief. So your question is a very good one, Norman, in terms of, was it the right time? Well, in hindsight, yes, it was the right time, but it was a time that required a tremendous amount of courage and personal fortitude on the part of the individuals who chose to testify. And for those of you who have time, if you go through the Japanese American National Museum's latest exhibit called Instructions to All People, you can see some of the testimony. It's in their little theater that they're playing right now. This is a photo of Los Angeles, where we had hearings here in Los Angeles. And you can see that the room is jam-packed, but there were actually several overflow rooms where the testimony was being shared. And if I had a pointer, there's a little black dot at the upper left corner, and that's my head, because I was a student at USC at the time, and I skipped classes to make sure that I was at that hearing. And I can't tell you what it was like to be in a room full of Japanese Americans telling their story, often for the first time, and there wasn't a dry eye in the audience. I'd like to share with you a couple of those testimonies. There was the testimony from William Kochiyama of the 442nd, and he said, I heard John J. McCloy, the former Assistant Secretary of War, allege that the Battle of Midway had been lost. Some of us Nisei might have pledged our allegiance to the other side. McCloy's opposition tore through me like a dum-dum bullet. For the record, I bitterly resent his assumption and categorically deny that some of us would have been turncoats. It was that type of testimony that talked about the loyalty of Japanese Americans during World War II that was very helpful during this commission hearing. And Sumi, is that you? I don't know. Okay, so Sumi, okay, so this, you're talking about this person right here. Okay, Sumi, you want to wave? And so Sumi is right here. Thank you for being there. And here's a very historic photo. And this gentleman's name is Jim Kawaminami, who was in the 100th 442nd, who was testifying when his testimony was disrupted by, who's that woman? Lillian Baker, who was a very anti-redress voice here in Gardena. She got up, took his testimony, and tore it away from him. And as you can see, 2 sheriff deputies intervened. And at the conclusion of that scuffle, Mr. Kawaminami looked at the commissioners and said, see, this is the kind of people we have to deal with. And that was the type of testimony and the importance of the testimony that our veterans had to share. I'd like to share just one other testimony with you, and that is from a woman, so not a veteran, Aiko Deloyd, who was in Poston. And she read, the stress of going into camp, the poor diet, the worry, hastened the death of my mother. She was 52 years old. She had to be cremated. There was no choice. My sorrow that I have to this day is that I could not put a fresh flower on her grave. All of our flowers were made of Kleenex. And I remember at the Los Angeles hearings, there was a dentist, Dr. Sonoda, who testified, Kiyoshi Sonoda, who testified that because he had some medical training, when he was put into camp, he was put in charge of the infirmary. And he talked about his first patient, a young, dehydrated infant. And Dr. Sonoda said that under normal circumstances, he would have been able to treat that baby and make him well. But because he didn't have the proper supplies and didn't have the proper equipment, all he could do is hold that infant in his hands and feel its last twitch before he died. And as he told this story, Dr. Sonoda had tears streaming down his face. And in the audience, his wife was sitting there and she said, "Kiyoshi is crying." Kiyoshi doesn't cry. Kiyoshi didn't even cry at his own father's funeral. But on that day, Kiyoshi Sonoda did cry. And an entire community cried with him as we began to find the courage to tell our story and to demand acknowledgement and an apology. And as powerful as these testimonies were, I would argue that the more powerful testimonies took place in people's homes, around their dining room tables, around their living room tables, as the Nisei and the Issei would ask the Sansei, "Can we really win this redress movement?" And the Sansei would say, "We don't know, but we have to try." But more importantly, the Sansei would ask their Nisei parents and Nisei grandparents, "Tell us what happened. Tell us truly what it was like for you during that time." And for the first time, the stories would be traded back and forth across the generations. The commission comes out with its findings in 1983, and they essentially say that the camps were wrong, and that the camps were the result of wartime hysteria, racial prejudice, and a failure of political leadership. A failure of political leadership. Very powerful words to aim at one of the most beloved presidents in the history of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But it was clear that we had made a mistake as a nation. So now we're ready to go to the Congress. Now we're ready to make the argument that, yes, we deserve an apology and monetary redress payments. How do you make this argument to the Congress? How do you tell them we deserve this? If we walk in there and say, "Look, we're Japanese Americans, you did us wrong, and you owe us an apology," it's going to be looked at as an ethnic-specific bill. It's going to be looked at as a very liberal bill, and only the most liberal Congress folks are going to vote for it. And so as I was talking to Bob Matsui, in the Congress you need 218 votes to get it passed. We probably would have about 100 liberal Democrats voting for it. How do you frame this bill so that people pay attention to it? Thoughts? Go ahead. There's no wrong answers. One way is, what do you call this bill, right? And as George is referring to, it was originally numbered HR, House Resolution 442. So we name it after the 442nd. So again, an incredibly important way of beginning to frame this, that this isn't just about Japanese Americans, it's about Americans, it's about loyalty, it's about fighting for this nation. How else do we frame this? Protecting the Constitution. What's the name of the bill? Eventually, what becomes the name of the bill? Very good. You read the program booklet. I'm very proud of y'all. But the Civil Liberties Act. We didn't call it, "Let's help the poor Buddha heads that were put in camp bill," right? We called it the Civil Liberties Act, so that this was about the Constitution. This was about something that both Republicans and Democrats could both agree on, and that's equal opportunity. We just disagree on how to get to equal opportunity. But Japanese Americans, all we wanted during World War II was to have equal opportunity. Yes, we would send our sons to war. Yes, we would contribute to the war effort, but we wanted to be treated as Americans during that time. So how we framed it, in terms of how we named the bill, that it was about the Constitution, that we wrapped ourselves in the American flag and the American values and the Constitution, began to be a way for us to reach out to lobbying for this particular bill. The veterans played an incredible role in lobbying for this bill. So some of you may recognize this gentleman, Rudy Tokiwa, and this is a photo of Rudy when he was in Italy. He was 16 years old when he lied about his age in order to go off and fight for the United States of America. So in 1987, in the summer of 1987, there's a large Asian American lobbying trip to Washington, D.C. And Rudy, now much older, joins that group, right? And there's 3 of them to go to visit a particular representative, Charles Bennett from Florida. And Charles Bennett is a well-respected Democrat from Florida, and he's told 2 of his junior representatives, you vote the way I vote on this bill. Now, Rudy shows up at the lobbying trip, and he's wearing his Army uniform, and he walks on crutches. But now, what he doesn't tell everyone is that he walks on crutches because of an accident after the war. Image is everything, and he's going to use it. Bless Rudy's heart. He's going to use it, right? So they go to Charles Bennett's office. Charles Bennett is late. Not there. They wait 10 minutes. Still no Charles Bennett. 15 minutes, no Charles Bennett. Finally, Charles Bennett walks through, and he looks at them and he goes, yeah, what can I do for you? A very warm greeting, right? So they go into his office. It's Rudy and it's 2 community lobbyists, and they say, oh, Representative Bennett, we're here about HR 442. We'd like to get your support. He stops them mid-track and he says, stop. I know all about your bill. I'm telling you right now, I'm not voting, and excuse my language, this is what I was told. He said, I'm not voting for any goddamn bill that makes my country apologize to anybody. So you might as well leave. So that's pretty clear, right? The 2 community representatives says, oh, well, thank you very much, Representative Bennett. They start to leave. Rudy stays seated. Bennett looks at him and says, didn't you hear what I just said? And Rudy says, oh, before I leave, I just wanted to say thank you. And Bennett says, thank you. I just told you I'm not voting for your damn bill. I guess, that's how they talk to each other. And Rudy says, no, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about thanking you for your service to this country as a representative and also as a veteran. Because I know you wake up every damn morning thinking about that bullet that's in your back the way I think about the bullet that's in my back. Rudy had done his homework. He knew that Charles Bennett was a veteran. He knew that Charles Bennett had been injured. And so Bennett looks at him and he says, you're all right, you son of a bitch. Again, this is how veterans talk to. Don, is that how veterans talk to each other? But he said, you're all right, you son of a bitch. You can leave now. So Rudy then says, okay, fine. Rudy calls his office, calls Bennett's office every day for several weeks after that, saying, reminding the staff, tell the congressman to vote for this bill. Finally, the congressman acquiesces and says, look, tell that guy I'll vote for his bill. I'll vote for his bill. This is in June. The bill hits the House floor in September, right? By that time, Charles Bennett has once again changed his mind because the bill now is too expensive. So they're going to the House floor, they're arguing on the floor of the House, and Representative Mineta walks up to Charles Bennett and says, hey, do you see who's up in the rafters? So he looks up into the rafters. In the handicapped section, with his army scarf on, staring at him, is Rudy Tokiwa. Now, I can't tell you how Charles Bennett thought. I can't tell you what he was thinking in that moment, but I can tell you how he voted. He voted for the bill, and so did 2 of his junior representatives. So Rudy Tokiwa helped to get 3 votes for the Civil Liberties Act in that case. And there are countless other stories that reflect the role that the veterans played in the lobbying for this bill. And Grant Uchifusa, who was the LEC strategist for the JACL, put it best when he said, no vets, no redress. It was very clear that all you had to do was begin to tell the story of these young men who had come out of the concentration camps on the mainland and out of the plantations in Hawaii at a time when their nation had turned their back on them and stood up for liberty and justice and the American way. And with that story, who could question our loyalty? And so the role of the vets in persuading members of Congress was very, very incredibly important. Now, along with the role of the vets, there, of course, was a contingency of others as we reached out to our African American brothers and sisters, our white American brothers and sisters, Latino and Native American brothers and sisters. Clearly, in order for this bill to pass, it had to be a bipartisan effort. And so truly it was a coalition of individuals who helped this bill pass during the late 80s. And just in the interest of time, I'm going to move past this one. And can we play this?
Just introducing a few written remarks by the staff is not adequate. Or making a few comments with respect to one of my colleagues' amendments earlier is not adequate. There comes a moment when one has to speak to tell his or her own story vis-a-vis the proposition that is before the body. One of my distinguished colleagues on the other side of the aisle stated that he was born in 1942, has no recollection of the war. This gentleman was born in 1935, so I do recall the war and felt the war through the body of a child and saw it through the eyes of a child. My home was in the middle of the block on Wood Street in West Oakland. On the corner was a small grocery store owned by Japanese people. My best friend was Rollin, a young Japanese child, same age. I will never forget, Mr. Chairman and members of this body, never forget, because the moment is burned indelibly upon this child's memory, 6 years of age. The day the 6x trucks came to pick up my friend. I would never forget the vision of fear in the eyes of Rollin, my friend, and the pain of leaving home. My mother, as bright as she was, try as she may, could not explain to me why my friend was being taken away as he screamed not to go. And this 6-year-old black American child screamed back, "Don't take my friend." No one could help me understand that. No one, Mr. Chairman. So it wasn't just Japanese Americans who felt the emotion, because they lived in the total context of community. And I was one of the people who lived in community. And so I would say to my colleagues, this is not just compensation for being interned. How do you compensate Rollin, 6 years of age, who felt the fear that he was leaving his home, his community, his friend, Ron, the black American who later became a member of Congress, Rollin, the Japanese American who later became a doctor, a great healer. This meager $20,000 is also compensation for the pain and the agony that he felt and that his family felt. This meager $20,000, in 1942 terms, $2,800, is also compensation for the thousands of dollars of personal belongings that were strewn on the streets on 10th and Wood Street in West Oakland in 1942. Because in case you don't know it, they could only take what they could carry. And so the little football that we played in the streets the games that we played that took up hours of our time in the streets, the furniture that we romped on and raffled upon as children in 1942 in the streets. So there's $20,000 in this formula that if you were in for one day, you get a few nickels. If you were in for 3 years, you get the whole $20,000. As if we could play that game. This is not about how long you were in prison. It is about how much pain was inflicted upon thousands of American people who happen to be yellow in terms of skin color, Japanese in terms of ancestry. But this black American cries out as loudly as my Asian American brothers and sisters on this issue. So this formula, while well-intended, does not in any way address the reality of the misery, Mr. Chairman. It must be rejected out of hand because it doesn't address the misery. Vote for this bill without this amendment and let Roland feel that you understood the pain in his eyes and the sorrow in his heart as he rode away screaming, not knowing when and if he would ever return. I yield back to Valerie.
You know, I've seen that clip now 1,000 times, and it still moves me. And I got to tell you my Ron Dellum story. I'm in Washington, D.C. I haven't interviewed him yet. There's a call for the representatives to vote, and I see this tall African-American man walking briskly to go and vote. And I said, oh, that's Ron Dellums. So I've got to say something to him. So I run up to him and said, Congressman Dellums, Congressman Dellums. And he looks at me, he's got this hard look on his face, like, what do you want? You know, and I said, this will only take a second. My name's Mitch Maki. I'm a professor. I show your clip about supporting Japanese redress to my students. And I just wanted to thank you. And in that moment, you see him soften, you know, and he looks at me and he says, thank you, my brother. And I didn't know what to say. So I simply said, no, thank you, my brother. The amazing thing, and I had neglected to say that what he was arguing in that moment was that somebody had put forth an amendment that said, let's not pay everybody $20,000, let's pay them per diem. If you're in camp for 1 day, you get $5. If you're in camp for 2 days, $10. And that's when he made that argument. This is not about how long you've been in prison, it's about the pain and suffering, right? And the amazing thing about that speech is that it was the last speech of the day, and he had already spoken briefly on a technical issue. And as I talked to him, he said, I wasn't planning on speaking, but in the moment I felt compelled to do so, and you just saw the result of that. Yeah. So it passes the House floor, and one other thing I neglected to say, it was voted on September 17th, 1987. Purposely, it was the only bill that was voted on that day. September 17th, what's the significance of September 17th? Any guesses? September 17th and September 17th, 1987 in particular, was the 200th anniversary of the signing of the Constitution. It's Constitution Day. And so we purposely picked that day to argue the bill on the House floor. 8 months later, in April, it hits the Senate. And we know it's going to pass the Senate because of Spark Matsunaga. Spark Matsunaga, the senator from Hawaii, again, that decorated war veteran, had gone and lobbied all 99 other senators, and in the process of doing that, had secured 69 co-sponsors, so with himself, 70 votes. We knew that the bill would pass the Senate floor. The only thing of note is that on that particular day, there was a Republican senator from North Carolina, Jesse Helms, who put forth an amendment saying, we would not pay redress to Japanese Americans until Japan paid redress to the soldiers that it killed at Pearl Harbor. To the shame of the Senate, in 1988, a US senator still could not distinguish between what a nation had done to its own citizens versus what a warring nation had done to another nation's soldiers, right? But to the Senate's credit, only 2 other senators supported that amendment. Even senators who eventually voted against the bill said, this is not what the bill is about. This is not about redress for others. This is about what we did to American citizens. The bill passes the Senate. So now we need only one more vote to get this to become law. And I gotta tell you that in 1988, when it passed the Senate, my personal feeling was, we fought the good fight, we went as far as we can go, but there is no way we're gonna get that last vote. Because that last vote, that last person who signed on was the President of the United States. And for those of you who remember, in 1988, it was none other than President Ronald Reagan, right? A very conservative president, a president whose administration had been fighting against redress in the courts as well as in the legislature. There was no way, in my mind, Ronald Reagan was going to sign this bill. But the true believers in the redress movement said, hey, we've come this far, we've got to keep pushing. Now, the truth about Ronald Reagan, whether you agree with his policies or not, I think the one thing that most people could agree on was that he was a great communicator. He had the ability to tell stories in such a way that it would touch people's hearts. But the opposite was also true of Ronald Reagan. If you could tell him a story that would touch his heart, you could have a great advocate on your hands. So the question was, what story could we tell Ronald Reagan that would make him understand what this bill was all about? Well, remember I mentioned to you that young Sergeant Kazuo Masuda who said, fighting for the United States is the only way I know that I can make the country a better place for my family. 2 weeks after giving that interview, Sergeant Masuda was killed in battle, fighting for his nation, the United States of America. After the war, his family comes back to California and settles back in their hometown of Santa Ana, California. And they want to bury their son in the local cemetery. But the local community says, no, no Jap body in our cemetery. Never mind that he was a decorated war veteran. Never mind that he died fighting for his country, the United States of America. No Jap body. The Army realizes that this is a PR fiasco and decides to send out a contingent of Army officers to have a medal ceremony for the Masuda family. And the Masuda family was presented with a medal by General Stilwell. And that evening, they had a convention dinner. And there was a young American captain by the name of Ronald Reagan. And that night, Ronald Reagan read these words to the audience. He said, "The blood that is soaked into the sand is all of one color. America stands unique in the world, the only country not founded on race, but on an ideal. Mr. and Mrs. Masuda, as one member of the American family, to another, for what your son Kazuo did, thanks." Now, Ronald Reagan didn't write those words, but he read them with great feeling because he was a wonderful actor. You actually haven't seen his films, have you? He was an actor, and he read them with great feeling. But in 1988, that story was relayed back to President Reagan. And he acknowledged remembering that family. And he also acknowledged, he said, "I remember what those soldiers did for our country." President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act on August 10th, 1988, thereby giving an apology to Japanese Americans who had been affected by Executive Order 9066, and also granting $20,000 redress payment for every individual, as well as creating a $50 million trust fund. The catch was, you had to be alive on that day. You had to be alive on August 10th. If you died on August 11th or 12th, your family would get the money, no problem. But if you had died any time before that, August 9th, August 8th, or any in the years before that, you get nothing. You don't even get the apology. Why do you think they did that? Why was that clause put in there? Part of it was, yes, it would save half the money, because it was estimated that of the 120,000, 60,000 or so had died. So you're cutting it right in half. Instead of 2.4 billion, you're only going to have to give out 1.2 billion, something like that. So clearly a money saver. But there was something, even from my perspective, more sinister in terms of what was being saved. Who said that? Future politics, and I'm going to expound on that, I think. It saves setting a precedent that other groups could file for redress for people who are no longer alive. And in particular, the thought was about African American slavery, right? So that it was clear that the individuals involved in passing this bill, did not want to set that precedent, or could not set that precedent, I should put it that way. Because I asked Representative Mineta, why did you put that clause in there? And his response was, you don't want to see how legislation or sausage is made. Sometimes you have to put in bad things in order to get it done. But more to the point, what he was very clear about is that had that clause not been put in there, the conservative parts of the Senate and the House would not have allowed that bill to pass. So it was a compromise, if you will, that he knew it had to be put in there in order for the bill to pass. So Ronald Reagan signs the bill on August 10th, 1988, and I think he did so partly because of the Kazuo Masuda story, and the role of the veterans. The other thing that can't be denied is that it was his last year in office. So he had the freedom to do things that he wouldn't have had the freedom to do if it was his second year in office or if he was going to run for re-election. And thirdly, the Asian American community was starting to grow in political power, and George Bush needed to carry California. So these are different things that start to come together, that coalesce into why he would sign the bill. Now, as we look at this bill, we know who everybody in the picture is. Starting from the far left, you have Spark Matsunaga, Norm Mineta, Pat Saiki, who was from Hawaii, the representative from Hawaii, Pete Wilson from California, a lot of Japanese Americans in California, Dan Young, because the Alaskan Aleutians were in the bill also, Bob Matsui. If you see the man on Bob's right shoulder, that's the senator from Alaska. And then on the far right is Harry Kajihara. But nobody knew who this Hakujin man, this Caucasian man with the red tie is on the right side. We'd all look at the photo and say, who is that? Who is that? So Trina just said it's the guy from Washington. So close, but yet so far. His name is Bill Lowry. The guy from Washington was Mike Lowry. Because of a clerical error, the wrong Lowry was invited. And it's kind of a curiosity as to why he showed up, because he voted against the bill at every turn except for the last conference bill. Just a humorous trivia fact about the signing of Redress. But in signing this bill, it brought to fruition the culmination of this effort for America to restore its promise, that we are a land of laws under which people have equal protection, regardless of the color of their skin, regardless of the nation from which we come, regardless of the God we choose to worship. And in doing so, in a very measured way, the United States took that step forward in doing that. But as we've oftentimes said at Go for Broke, justice is fragile. And it's important for all of us to continue to be vigilant and to remember that our Nisei veterans did more than be vigilant. They showed tremendous courage and loyalty in what they did, both in Europe and the Pacific Theater. So I want to thank you all for joining us here today and in recapping this whole campaign for justice. And Don, in particular, I'm going to single you out and thank you for your service to our nation. And I speak to you, but I'm really speaking to all the veterans and all the World War II Nisei veterans in particular who made this country a better place. So thank you very, very much. I know we've run over a little bit, but if there are any questions, let's take a few minutes and answer any questions that people might have. Yes?
What role did the vets of the Texas Lost Battalion play in lobbying their members of Congress?
So the Texas Lost Battalion, for those of you who don't know that story, there were 211, this was during World War II, 211 white American soldiers from Texas who were caught behind Nazi lines, and they were being bombarded every day. The Army sent in several battalions trying to rescue them. None could break through. Finally, they turned to the 442nd, and they said, they've been having some success, let's send them in. Also, the underlying sub-message was they were expendable. The 442nd realized that this was a suicide mission, that they would be cannon fodder, and they also realized, though, that the eyes of a nation would be upon them and that their loyalty would be called into question. Sure enough, the 442nd did break through that line, did save those 211 white American soldiers, but in the process took over 800 casualties. But that was the math of the day. And in answer to your question, as to the 442nd became honorary Texas citizens, right? And also the members of the Texas Battalion, the 211, helped to lobby some of their local representatives. Jim Wright was Speaker of the House at that time, and was very much aware of what happened with the 442nd and the Lost Battalion. Other questions? Yes.
You mentioned that 1,000 Nisei in the camps who volunteered. How many were drafted?
Well, okay, so it's about 1256 initially came out of the camps, right, when it was still in voluntary status. I don't know the exact number that were drafted. I can find that out. By the war's end, over 33,000 Japanese Americans either had volunteered and or were enlisted. Not all of them had gone overseas, because some of them were still stateside and so forth. I don't have that exact number off the top of my head as to how many came out of the camps. It was less than Hawaii just because of the numbers that were in play, but it was well over 1256 because that was just the initial number that came out. And certainly when they started drafting them, then they had less choice in the matter. They either had to comply, or if they resisted, then that was a high penalty to pay at that time. So if you come give me your number afterwards, I promise to get that number for you, because we should know that. Other questions? Carolyn. So it's what they're referred to as the Latin American Japanese, because it wasn't just Peru, it was some of the other countries in that area. And actually what countries like Peru did was to incarcerate those individuals of Japanese ancestry. They were then sent to the United States, and they were held in some of the same camps the Japanese Americans were held in, right? And some of them were to be used as trade with Japan to get American citizens back. They were not included in the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. And to this day, the campaign continues to get them acknowledgement and reparations for what happened to them. And in fact, just recently there was testimony in Washington regarding the Japanese Latin American experience. So that is one of the unresolved issues of that time. So, Teresa. The breakdown was that it was about, I don't have the exact numbers, but it was about 70% Democrat, 30% Republican in the House, right? And we crafted arguments, and I say we, meaning the Japanese American community, in whatever way would work, and certainly, as I mentioned earlier, equal opportunity was something that was one of the ways of crafting that issue. But there was a representative named Pat Swindle from Stone Mountain, Georgia. And later on, he would be arrested for embezzlement. So I guess Swindle was an appropriate name. But it wasn't quite spelled the same way. But a very conservative Republican who was pro-life. And on the House floor, he even made the argument that if you believe in pro-life, if you believe in equal opportunity for the fetus, it is the same equal opportunity that we are describing for Japanese Americans. So if you are pro-life, you should vote for this bill. So who would have thought of making that connection between being pro-life and Japanese American redress? But we certainly took that issue, right? I wouldn't say that there were different arguments as much as it was applied slightly differently to whatever the issues were. If, for example, there was a representative who was more in tune with the rights of minority religions. There's one representative who was Catholic who understood that Catholics always got the short end of the stick. It was brought forward in that regard. Certainly for people like Newt Gingrich, who voted for this bill, it was crafted as an issue of equal opportunity and the Constitution and so forth. So that was the main thrust, and then equal opportunity was right with that, and people like Pat Swindle took it to an extreme. Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm going to be happy to hang around and answer any questions that you have. Thank you for joining us here this afternoon.